now I'm recording.
Okay.
Cool. So, so when I'm beginning to design a sound,
Hmm.
it depends on first if I'm just kind of doing something for something's sake, where I'm just sort of just starting out with nothing in mind. Then it depends on kind of what I've been doing, what I'm into, what like technique I learned that I'm trying to screw around with, like that. That'll be whatever I use first. But if I'm trying to make something that I've heard, like some sound that I heard someone else do, then I'm like, that sounds cool. I want to do that. Then the way that I break that down is I'll begin by identifying the process most likely to get me the sound. And by that, I mean the basic synthesis type, of which there's subtractive synthesis, additive synthesis, FM synthesis, and loosely wavetable synthesis.
Hmm.
Wavetable synthesis is kind of like the Y of vowels.
Right.
It's not
Yeah, I just
usually,
got I just got a serum.
yay,
Yep. It's
serum's,
awesome.
serum's cool.
Um,
Um,
Go ahead.
yeah, so then I'll identify what, so like, an example of that would be if I'm doing, like if I listen to like a Zomboy track and I hear some kind of one of that like metallic kind of wobble bass,
Right.
that like that I will identify as something that I can do with FM synthesis. So I'll start
Right.
with that
Squelchy, yeah.
kind of thing. And then if I hear like if I'm listening to a more like drum and bass kind of like neuro track, like noisy or something, I'll listen to that and I'll say, okay, I can do that with basic subtractive synthesis kind of stuff.
Hmm.
And how the effects go after that are pretty much the same depending. Like it's like it's usually like you say like where to apply reverb and that kind of thing. Like it's usually sort of sound specific or at least sound class specific.
Right, yeah, and I could listen to a sound and say, okay, I hear, obviously a long decay reverb and things like that. But I tend to I feel real uninspired. Say just any sort of dubstepy wobble growl sound, whatever it may be. The first say you got to say you designed a preset in Massive or something like that, then right off the bat it still kind of feels raw, like it doesn't. It's too much in, like it's not tucked in the mix too well. Um,
Well,
and
that kind of stuff is as you have said a mixing problem. Like that's a like you have mentioned compressing and limiting and that kind of thing, which helps in some circumstances, but for the most part, that's kind of a like the problems that you have are of a leveling and an EQing thing,
right,
where like making like the thing that people have a lot of problems with when they're talking about like you said the dubstep growl thing, especially when they're doing the kind of dubstep or electro or really any of this bass music that has a lot of different bass sounds in it, that making the individual different bass sounds sound like they belong to each other,
right,
that they are a part of the same track and not just like random things pulled out of a hat that weren't really put together very well.
right.
And that is pretty much basically at its most basic part. That's an EQing thing. Um,
Okay.
Weirdly, a little bit more advanced would be to kind of solve that problem with leveling, but that depends on sort of what you're doing with your mastering and that kind of thing, whatever. But so at the most basic level, you can solve that issue with EQing. And like basic example of that would be like you have a sound that has it favors high end frequency. It's very harsh high end like fizzy kind of sound, and then you have another one that's very dull, very not very high frequency kind of thing.
Right,
Then you can either pump the high frequencies up of the dull one or bring down the high frequencies of the other one to make them more in line with each other.
right.
And that for basically every part of the spectrum, every sound, especially like growly moving sounds, and Reese's and filters and whatever, they tend to accentuate a particular part of the spectrum that if you layer it over with like another sound, like something else that doesn't have the same kind of presence as
Hmm.
defined by your EQ, then it'll sound weird and different.
Right, right.
This came up a lot when I was doing metal back in the day, and the clearest example of this problem is when you try to combine clean guitars with distorted guitars,
Hmm.
because clean guitars, because they're clean, they have a extremely different sort of presence and frequency profile and like a sound to them that compared to distorted guitars, which are very full spectrum, very like in your face and everywhere, that kind of thing. And they
Right.
and they also like the distorted guitars. They also tend to they kind of roll off on the highs because if he didn't, it would sound awful.
Right.
And but clean guitars have a lot of highs in there. It makes it really clear and sparkly and present and whatever. And so like a problem that would happen is that you do the typical metal intro where you have your clean guitar intro and then you go into the heavy guitars. That like it just sounds like you're in a different
Mostly.
song now because
Yeah. Right. Exactly. Yeah.
the clean guitars didn't have the same kind of profile as the distorted guitars.
Uh huh.
And the solution to that is just to EQ the clean guitars so that they sound like the distorted guitars.
Okay.
And so
Okay.
they still are clean guitars, but they're not. But now they sound like but they're from the same song.
Right.
And this principle can be applied to any music at all. This is always a problem for everything.
Now, to say when you're putting together, so using your example, going from one part to another, one part, the clean guitar might be the focal point in the mix, and then the distorted in the other part, for instance. And then obviously, so matching that transition. And then as far as when you're, it's like, I tend to, because maybe my mix doesn't sound good. I'll just like start adding more sounds, and then not. Then it becomes too much, and nothing really seems to be popping. And I know you obviously put some distortion on it, helps kind of fill out the frequency spectrum depending on the sound, and things like that. Um, so, do you have any? When you're writing a track, do you kind of pick a sound that is kind of your focal point and then work around it, or how do you work in composition aspect to that?
Well, depending on the style, like if you listen to kind of a reference for whatever style that you're attempting to emulate, like we mentioned Zomboy, or you could
Hmm.
listen to someone like on the electro side, listen to like Mort Fustang or Maddie or something. Like,
Hmm.
um, what you tend to notice is that they do have a focal point. They do have like a sound that is like the song's hook. This is the
Right.
thing. This is the thing that defines what the song is, and like why you're listening to it because you're listening to the sound. And everything else around it is very much around it. And another thing that you might notice, especially for uh, the more modern dubstep stuff, is that there's not as much happening as you might think there is.
Right. It's like monophonic kind of sound going on as far. I mean, and then obviously at any one point, there's not more than a couple sounds
Yeah,
going on in the
and that
forefront.
beyond just like a compositional tool, that also is very much a mixing tool because the less there is to mix, the easier it is to do that. Like it's not
Sure.
there's not as much conflict, there's not as much like layering problems, and like it's just all around easier. But what ends up happening when like you're not sort of conscious of this fact is that you'll do sort of what you described, where like it doesn't really sound right the way it is, so let's put more stuff in it, and then you have more and more stuff, and then the stuff becomes too much, and then there's not really going to be a way to mix that sounds okay.
Right. Right.
But like if you do want to do that, because sometimes that can sound cool to have a whole bunch of stuff happening, then don't be afraid to turn stuff down, especially higher frequency things. Like what like I personally like I had problems with this before I sort of got it, which was that higher frequencies require less power to sound as loud as lower frequencies,
Mm.
just by the nature of how they move through the air. That's just how all that works. So like you can have like half as much power on like 10K and higher for tones in that range to sound as loud as something that is on like a bass level kind of thing.
Mhm.
So mix wise, what this means is that we don't need to force as much level out of the higher frequencies for them to come through the mix. So that, and this is wonderful for like headroom related reasons because we can just turn stuff down and it'll still be there. And the easiest sort of most noticeable example of this is if you listen to any of these really loud, punchy, super broy dubstep tracks, pay attention to what the hi-hats are doing, because the hi-hats, while in your memory may seem very present and wide and loud and whatever, if you listen to the actual track, the hi-hats are super duper quiet,
Right. Right.
especially in comparison to the kick and the snare. It's almost like I've always tried to sort of build drums in like a kit fashion where like you can imagine it being a thing that a person is playing, just because I come from metal and bands and whatever, so I'm used to that. But the way that these drums are mixed is almost like the hats and the kick and the snare are all separate entities. that have very little to do with each other. And that creates the sort of the profile and the mix that we get out of the Zomboys and the Must Dies and anyone else on the Never Say Die label or Firepower for that matter.
Mm-hmm.
And like that kind of unintuitive idea of just being like, turn the stuff down and it'll sound better is just it's a little bit weird, but that's what happens.
So the hi-hats, you would say, and something like that are, because there's more high frequency in the mid-rangey sounds, you're turning down the hi-hat because just to keep everything in balance.
Well, the hi-hats will have way more high frequency sort of motion in them than any of the basses that you're going to make. Even if something I sort of discovered studying stuff lately is that like I tend to, and this is kind of hard. This is also sort of a listening environment problem where like you have to sort of know if your headphones or your speakers, or your monitors or whatever are not lying to you, because they can do that. And like if you learn sort of how they lie to you, then you can compensate for it correctly. Because what'll happen is like for example, I tend to like to push high frequencies pretty hard just because that's how it just sounds nice to me in my environment.
Right.
And I also like to bring down sort of the 2K, 5K area because too much of that doesn't sound good to me. But if I actually listen to tracks that I consider to be references, that are, as to say, perfect examples of whatever it is that it represents, then I'll notice that they'll do usually the opposite. And some of that is just MP3 processing, but even if I get a WAV file from like Beatport and I listen to the full spectrum without the conversion issues, then I notice that they do actually roll off on the highs pretty heavily, and also that the 2K 5K is pretty sharp. And as a result, I can conclude that my listening environment is incorrectly representing what I am doing to make it sort of be the way that I want it to be. So you have to really need to sort of you need to like pay attention to that kind of stuff all the time and use reference tracks, because we mentioned the high frequencies of the basses and the hi-hats have a lot of like 10K plus in them, and the sort of the mid-rangey basses that we're making with the sort of the style, they really shouldn't have as much. They shouldn't be comparable. They shouldn't even compete, because that's sort of what the hats are to be the things that are in that higher frequency range, so that other stuff doesn't have to be.
And then if you don't have a hi-hat, I know you could put a noise sweep or something up there just to I'll fill it out for, because I've noticed that that's a problem that I had too. I'll be working on something, but then I'll realize, oh, I don't have anything representing the high, and just even though you haven't got to that, you need to have something there, else the whole thing doesn't sound right.
Yes, white noise is pretty prevalent in this sort of stuff. I personally don't like using it, but it is definitely a solution to that issue.
Sure, yeah. Okay, to give an example, and this brings me into another question, is when I'm doing sound design, I feel like I need more. Obviously, a lot of say notes for something is not a very complex melodic thing going on, but in the sound design, there's a lot of modulation that just gives it character and depth to the sound. So, for instance, say either Milo&Otis, I really like their sound and their music and the sound. But say, for instance, the Skrillex, the elephant only getting younger, or the Recess track. Are you familiar with those?
Yeah.
I know you're not like too big into trappy type stuff, but there are some dubsteppy type sounds. And so, for instance, there's the one, I think it's the elephant sound. They have like two sounds in both of those songs. One would be kind of like a dubsteppy growl sound, and then the other one would be kind of like a bendy kind of lead thing, but it kind of is talky. Are you familiar with what I'm referring to?
I actually haven't listened to this track, so let me sort of give it a shot.
Is it the Milo&Otis remix?
No, this is the Skrillex version. Is there?
Play the Milo&Otis remix.
Ah, all right. Oh, come on. Yeah. Okay.
So that was that kind of there's the growl, and then there's that kind of bendy thing, and obviously, any starting out, say, I don't know how you would break that down, but when I hear that, I hear either a side chaining kind of volume envelope on the beginning of it, or either amp envelope on the beginning of it, and then there's either a pitch band or a formant shift kind of thing, and it kind of sounds like a pulse, like a pulse width kind of sound. So how would you describe that, and how would you approach to? Because it's a simple sound, but there's a complexity to the sound design aspect.
Well, let's have a look. I'm gonna share my screen, and then I'm gonna record a little bit of it just so that I can have it. I can look at it. Cool. All right. So we've got the thing. Now, most trap leads that are like this that I hear that when people bring them to me, because I usually don't want to do this sort of stuff, but when I do look at them, I see what I'm looking at right now, which is like you can see the higher frequency moments here when they're being played and muted, because I muted it. See, what gets me is this kind of weird little in-betweeny bit.
Right.
Which it sounds like distorted reverb that they're putting behind the sound. Like,
right.
Simply, I bet you could do this in Massive. I bet what they did was they had a saw-ish sound. They put an envelope to be triggered on it whenever it hits, so that it has that sort of swelly nature of it, and then on the release it brings up sort of a shaper to come up on the insert,
like a distortion, because you hear it kind of like a sizzly kind of part to it.
I'm not 100% sure how you do that, because I'm not a big Massive person, but like, yeah, There's definitely some kind of distorted fade in there. Either that, or they're like layering some other sound in with the distortions and some post thing. There's a lot of ways you could approach doing this, but like as far as what they actually did, I'm gonna go ahead and bet Massive.
Sure. And as far as like where it's bending, can you hear how it bends?
Well, I mean, come on, repeat.
Kind of got a talk, a vowel-y aspect to it a little bit.
I'm hearing a vowel-y aspect in the lead. I'm just talking about this thing.
Oh, right.
And this sound is a little silly. You can kind of see it doing it. All right, right here is what sort of makes me think something weird is happening. This looks like, I mean, this is classic sort of phaser behavior.
Right.
Like you can kind of see it doing it with the bands here. That's what these sort of sharp bands look like, and it looks like they're kind of doing it over a really basic kind of vowel-y growl, and then they're phasing it with it. But the thing is, though, is that what I sort of thought was happening was that they have a kind of growl sample, and then they're sort of pitching the sample that they're kind of like. Right, that's what that sounds like right there. That they're kind of like screwing around with the pitch of the growl sample. I think this is a remix, so I don't know if that sample was in the original.
Right.
Because that would sort of make sense.
They have these sounds in a lot of their tracks.
Yeah.
They've been using that kind of bendy lead thing in a lot of.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. That growls. Yeah.
So that's from the original. So they're using the original sample and they're just screwing with the sample.
Okay. So you think that higher lead might be pitched up? Is that what you're saying?
No. The higher lead, I think, is just a saw wave.
Okay. Saw wave?
Yep. At least, I mean, that's what it's built on. Although there's some fun stuff you can do with a couple of things. So in Massive, I know how to do this in Massive, and I know how to do it in Harmor. Which do you prefer?
I got Massive, so.
All right.
I wish I had Harmor.
This particular trick involves using the frequency shifter.
Okay.
MIDI. Where far art thou, MIDI? So, the frequency shifter does kind of weird stuff. And the thing that it does is that it moves around harmonics, like, additively, which is sort of what, I mean, it's what Harmor does. See how kind of like it's scrunching the harmonics, but the higher area there. And so what you do is you do that like halfway, or really anywhere you want. But like the thing is, what happens is that like the oscillation of the saw wave isn't different. Like if I played some really low saw wave, you can kind of hear that the clicks of the saw wave are at one particular speed, and then if I make it higher, that speed is still there.
Right.
It's just that the harmonics are being crushed together.
Right.
And like I have a feeling that a lot of like trappy leads are based on doing this.
Okay. It kind of gives a pitch bend feel without changing the note.
Yeah, right? And then like if you screw stick some effects on this and distort it and do other fun things. Like, I don't know, phaser, and then... you don't do that there, do you? Let's put a chorus here, and then... It, like... It's a little bit interesting, but I kind of... Like, I did make one kind of trappy lead one time.
Good for you.
I'm really hoping I saved it as like that trap thing. I did. That trap lead. And like this was a harmor kind of thing.
Is that mainly that frequency shifter?
Yep. What I did in Harmony, it's kind of the opposite. It instead of it crushing up, it crushes down.
Okay.
So that was based on that sound, and then I had like a phaser going on in here too as well. And this is kind of another thing, is that I just put 2 big ass peaks before the distortion and the EQ,
Right.
just because I like it how it sounded there. It wasn't really much of a thing. And it just, play it lower and that kind of thing. And like for as far as the Milo&Otis track goes,
So are you on your patch? Are you using pitch bend at all?
sometimes, like on the
Okay.
there's actually a little bit of pitch bend on the beginning of the note, which is
Okay.
happening here. Could also kind of screw around doing this. A bit much. Like the pitch bendiness that I've seen in a lot of trap. Like I mean even. Like I have to imagine most of that's done manually, because it seems so very wild, and like
Right.
I mean you could do it with automation, but it would be kind of like, I mean you probably should, because then you have more control over it, but it just seems sort of like the results that I'm seeing on all the bendiness, that it seems it's free and wild and all over the place.
Right.
And
But there's basically, you're hearing what, 2 notes, right? It's like,
yeah, that's sort of how these tracks work as well. Is that like the sort of what the melody is usually
Right.
very simple, and it's very like what's a I mean the one trap track I actually like is the I Am Legion track.
Oh, yeah.
Choosing for You.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
And even that doesn't have a super complicated kind of.
That's just kind of like a detune saw with a real quick pitch.
Yep.
Yeah.
It's actually basically exactly like this little. Which is exactly as you said. It's actually just a regular Super Saw's 9 voice, pretty high, and then I got this sort of pitch thing going on.
Right. What do you have on your effects chain for there? Would you on a sound like that? I guess would it depend on what octave you're using it in? But do you EQ first, then some compression, then some distortion, or
this guy got distorted first, and then I EQ'd it in post.
Okay.
And then on the main sound, I did have reverb, but like I'm controlling it with this automation happening up here, so that like it shuts off.
Would you tend to put your reverb on the track, or go to a bus and that kind of sound?
I do it on the track.
Okay, and then how much are you compressing that together, or at all?
On the track, on the sound itself, not a super huge amount, but I guess I did do a bus, and then I don't know why I did a bus though. I didn't really do anything to it. What I did here with a bus could have been accomplished just as easily with the track. I don't compress it like as like a. Depends on if I really need to. For this sound, I really didn't need to.
Right.
But I am compressing it still because it's going through the mastering, which is super.
you might something like that. You might just limit it to catch the peaks kind of thing, not as a shaper, a sound shaper.
Yeah, I mean, I'll use side chaining and stuff like that, but I don't really like. Think about what compressors do. Their job in life, they're essentially really fast volume automators that exist to push peaks down so that you can keep stuff below a certain threshold with a certain amount of force. That's just all kind of what they do. Um, and that's really useful for a sound that has a lot of dynamic range, like a guitar or a singer or something. Things that like, they have really big transients and then a very weird shaped tail that you need to kind of shape to be something that you can use. But with something like a saw wave, even a saw wave with a bunch of effects, it doesn't really have any dynamic range. It has like a level that it's at, and it's always going to be at that level. The only dynamic range that it has is actually just the movement and the oscillation speed. And when you're compressing it hard enough to affect that, you are essentially distorting it. So at that level, you would just use distortion if you wanted to.
Right.
But compressing, I usually rely on compression for stuff like really heavily affected sounds that have, as a result, introduced a lot of dynamic range. Like if I use a lot of filtering and a lot of voluming and a lot of other weirdness that just does stuff to it, then it screws with the dynamic range. And then I use compression to kind of bring it back because probably it'll have affected the gain in ways that I don't like, and I'll have needed to do that. But unlike these kinds of leads, the sort of just bare naked saw leads, it doesn't really require a huge amount of compression, unless you do fun stuff like in the Milo&Otis track, where there's some in between stuff going on. And that what my assumption on that kind of stuff is that there was probably, you have the saw wave, you have the reverb, and you have this distortion on some element of it, and then it's only really audible after the sound is done, because when the sound's playing, that's what we're hearing, but then when it's off, it's being compressed super hard to bring the tail up, and then we get that kind of interaction with it. And that's mostly release time stuff. Like, it's happening after the sound is playing. It's happening to the post effects.
Okay.
So if we were to visualize the chain that would create this, it would be, you'd have your saw, you'd have reverb, you'd have a little bit of distortion, and then you would have compression on top of everything. It'd be the last thing.
Okay. And so you'd automate like the reverb to do some of those little fill-in things you're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, that's my assumption.
So it'd be, you would say, for instance, in that would be reverb, you had distortion, compression, and then that over?
Yeah, compression would, whatever it is that you're doing, compression would be the last thing. Maybe you'd have EQ after the compression to kind of help with the mixing. But
would you say compression and more of just like a limiting transient kind of control way, or in a...
No, it'd be a lot more forceful than that.
Okay. And would you tend to EQ before you would distort?
Sometimes. Depend, like, it does have an interesting effect on the sound depending on the kind of distortion that you use. I mean, that's purely like a experimentation thing, like just to see if it works for you or not for what you're doing.
Sure. Okay. I want to see if there's another example. Let's see. Advertisement, gross. Okay. Let's see. Skip. Let's see if this example is development different. Another question on that, the example of the elephant, that bass sound. So that growl would be, say, your typical kind of phasey growl type scenario. What else kind of modulation would you have in that to make it do that? Is there probably a pitch bend down? And...
I mean, the stuff that they did in that track was definitely a lot of pitch bending on the sound itself. From the actual, like, because if we want to talk about how to make that sound, we gotta look at the original and the actual track from Skrillex. Like that stuff. That's all like I mentioned earlier. That kind of FM business from like the Zomboid style stuff, and then on top of that you have your phaser to create those sort of striations that we saw in the spectrum. And then after that, with the Milo&Otis track, just take that sample and then start pitching it up and down, and you get kind of the behavior that they did.
Okay. So really, the phasing's a big part of these sounds.
Yeah.
Now, do you know any plug-in phasers that are good that are not? I don't have. I have a Mac. I have Ableton Live.
Pretty much every. I mean, there's phasers and then there's flangers, and they both do similar things, but they have a very subtly different sort of approach to it. But all of them work the same way.
Okay.
And if they have different, like if there are different plugins and different approaches, it's just that they have different ways of controlling the same aspects that are present in your basic everyday phasers and flangers. Sort of the basic rundown on how those things work is that it's based on it's based on really, really small delay times. It delays the audio with the echo, but they're so stupidly short that they cause phasing issues. They phase cancel, and the phase cancellation only applies to certain frequencies. And if while it's playing you're adjusting the delay time, it will move which frequency gets phase canceled. Because if it was only a static time, a static echo, there wouldn't be any movement. You would see the hole in the EQ and it would just be there. It wouldn't do anything. But those moving sort of bands that we saw is a result of changing the delay time. Theoretically, you could accomplish this with an actual delay plugin if it let you go that fast, but most of them don't. So it's not something that's super great. But phaser plugins do that, and that's why it creates that sound. So when you're trying to, and then there's like the depth control, and then there's dampening, and there's a whole bunch of other stuff. But the core aspect of what creates that sound is the delay. Mm-hmm. And sometimes you have to experiment with the depth and the delay on the sound to sort of put it on, move those two knobs on the sound, and just sort of see how that works out.
Okay. And as far as the that frequency shift thing, is that similar to like the warp? Can you do something similar to that in the warp section of Serum?
Don't know. I don't think so.
Is it kind of like?
No,
it's not
you
like
can't.
bending though.
It's not like no. It's an additive process. It's actually moving the harmonics around, which is I didn't know that's what Massive was doing for the longest time, but then only when I looked at it in like sort of the analysis that I would do with Edison that I see that I was going, oh, that's impressive.
Okay, so I might have to find some sort of external plug-in to.
I do not know if you can. I don't know if that's a thing you can do in post, to be totally honest.
Really?
Yeah, like the only time I've ever seen anything that can do that in post was actually a piece of hardware that was a modular synth that was a frequency shifter. Real quick, frequency shifter.
I got a Virus TI that they've added that section for that as well, and they have it with a vowel. It's like a filter section. I guess they have it as. Let me see.
Well, apparently Ableton has a frequency shifter.
Oh yeah. Audio effects.
It's a device.
Okay. All right, and then another back to kind of taking it like I want to, and maybe I'm too hardline with this, but I want to get the knowledge base that I could create a sound instead of just using like a sound from a sample library or whatever. I want to know how they got the sound of the kick that I like in the sample library to sound like that or something like that. So, for instance, I got Metrum. Are you familiar with what that is?
That sounds familiar.
But it's got like it's like a kick drum thing that is like a sampler, but it also has an oscillator that has pitch, a pitch bend curve on it. And if you just play that raw, you can't use that sound raw. So I always like end up messing with trying to make a kick with that, but I just can't get it to sound good.
Well,
And
as far as kicks go, really anything. Like when I'm not super great at synthesizing percussion, but I did try one time to make a metal kick drum, and I did.
that sounds good.
Like
Yeah, that sounds good.
this is citrus that I'm using to create the thing. And basically what I did is I opened up Superior Drummer, and I loaded up a kick I liked, which for this example I think it was this guy. So I looked at, like, this is an actual recording of an actual kick drum, and so I looked at this, and I looked at kind of like the behavior of the frequency spectrum. I sort of was like, okay, what's it doing there? And then I looked at it in Edison, which like this is mostly just spectral views, spectrograph, and zoom far enough in, and you can kind of make some assumptions about what it's doing and how it's moving around and that kind of thing. And then once I do that, I take oscillators inside Citrus, and I recreated each individual aspect of it. So like I made that pitch fall, which is what that oscillator is for in those kinds of synth that has that kind of thing. And then I made this kind of roomy blur that kind of existed in there.
Right, like a noise.
Yep.
Like a reverb almost. It's almost like a reverb layer.
Yep. And then there's a sort of higher frequency shenanigan going on. And then more kind of trashy. There's also the effects that are on as well. Like this kind of trashy room noise. That sort of thing. And then when they're all combined,
it sounds really good.
They layer together to form a thing. Like this is like whenever I talk about layering, whenever anyone talks about layering, there's really two kinds of layering. There's the sort of the wall of sound layering where you're putting a billion things together to sound like a billion things. Right. And then there's the one thing layer where you're putting together a whole bunch of stuff to sound like one thing. And percussion synthesis and layering different kicks and layering different snares or whatever, for me is all about making a whole bunch of stuff sound like just one thing. And like doing that is really all about analyzing the anatomy of whatever it is that you're building. And this is also true for synths. This is true for how I determine how to make sounds I don't know how to make. I do this to it, and I look at it, and then I try and figure out either what created it initially or what I could do to do something similar.
Right.
And so, like, for a kick drum, like, our anatomy is first broken up into sort of two parts. You have this lower frequency area, and then this higher frequency sort of clicky area. And then that individually we can sort of break into sort of the psychoacoustic stuff, where it's sort of like, okay, here's the original recording, and then here's the room sound, and then here's like the air sound, that kind of stuff. And you can try and synthesize that, which I did, which turned out to be kind of good, but it's like really hard to get that kind of stuff nailed down right. I have since not been able to do anything else. Like whenever I make kicks, it either sounds like this or it sounds like shit.
Right.
So it's like, it's sort of, I managed to do this one really good thing. I just kind of pigeonholed my way into that. And the same is kind of true for snares, although I was less effective on my snaring. Like trying to get...
Sounds like a drum machine.
Yeah. It was less effective at that, but the same basic principle applies to snares. Like if you look at an actual snare,
right,
that I like, that I think
you got the
good.
nice. It was a nice ring to it. That was nice.
Yeah, I was pretty happy with that metallic FM. I think it was this guy. No, is this dude? Yeah. To kind of make it sound like the resonance of a snare, a real one. Because like I was looking at these snares as sort of like the things I was trying to emulate.
Go back to that ring. That sounds kind of like that. They use that sound a lot. It's almost like that Energy song, the Skrillex and Milo&Otis. It's kind of got a metallic-y, ringy sound to it.
Yeah.
Is that same kind of type of sound going on?
Maybe.
How did you do that with your FM?
Well, this was let's see. This isn't serial, is it? No, it's not. Okay, so it's operator 3, which is at 670 something hertz, and then being modulated by this. And so the choice to make it like this, like I knew that like I have this tone here, which is a chord. And how did I make it a chord? How did I do that? There's a way I do that. I guess I did it through the unison. Yeah. Okay, so I have unison on, and then inside Citrus there's a sort of way to set a different pitch per each unison voice. So that's what I did to make that chord essentially. And then there's also a little bit of pitch falls happening here, just a tiny bit. And then I'm modulating that by a triangle wave that is also a different pitch and increasing in pitch. So you started with this, which even by itself, like even in the layer, as just that, like it sounds kind of like the sound, but it sounds too synthetic and too perfect. So the FM was really there to kind of dirty it up. And like this is the idea that I knew this would happen was mostly just born of experimentation and what I just said, which is that the first instance of it that being just the 3 notes was close but still too perfect, and so I needed to kind of screw with it, and so I just tried to find different ways to screw with it, and then doing it like this happened to be the one that worked.
So what 3 notes would you say those are?
I guess it's an octave. Let's see. This is the way the pitch works. We got, so this is, yeah, it's the full octave. So this is 1 octave, and this is, I guess that's the 7. So yeah, this is 1 3 5 3 1.
Huh.
And then it's being filtered as well. It's going through a high pass filter for reasons. It was a while ago that I made this. I guess because it went really low.
So it's it gives that hitting metal sound is the little, you get the ringing, but it's that little bend of something that gives it that hit in the metal, the attack of it.
Well, yeah. Well, let's talk about what metal sounds means, because there is definitely a very a sort of a harmonically relevant reason that we think of things that are metal as sounding metal, and it has to do with this idea of the enharmonicness of a sound, because like if you have all these harmonics and they're all perfectly harmonic, they're all 100% in tune and good and whatever, then it sounds like the tone. It sounds very synthetic. But the second the second they get kind of out of tune, we get this sort of almost metal. In fact, I made a bell one time. This is actually one of the reasons why I added a synthesis, is sort of looked at as like the end-all bell machine. What did I call it? It would have helped if I called it bell. I did. So like, there's a bunch of filtering going on and all stuff like that. But if I were to open up all the filters, this is the harmonic profile that's creating that sound, and it's very not harmonic. But then if I were to make it harmonic, it sounds like a weird harpsichord all of a sudden. Mm-hmm. But because we made the all the different tones not harmonic anymore, we get the metal sound. And so that was true for this sound here, where initially, without the FM, we have perfectly harmonic notes. We have a 1, a 7, a 1, a 5, and a 1. Like, that's what's happening. But then with the FM at such, it just spreads it out so that the harmonics are no longer relative pitches anymore. They're not notes that are in scales of any kind.
Right.
So as a result, our brains hear this as being like, these are alien sounds, and so it sounds like metallic, clangy, sort of not musical things.
Right. So is the FM is it shifting the harmonics?
Sort of. It's. Yeah. I mean, short answer is yes, but it's doing it in a very peculiar way. Like I'm doing this at 470 hertz, but like.
Okay. Hmm. Okay.
It's like it really is not this, but it is like extremely fast vibrato.
Right, right, right. Okay. So that sounds like something I could play with too.
It sounds a
As
lot of
far
fun.
as far
Yeah.
as man, also Fruity Loops has such a great MIDI bend. Like
Yeah, the slide notes.
yeah, I wish it's such a nightmare trying to do that just with the pitch bend. But do you have any tips for pitching from note to note? As far as it always sounds so sloppy when I try to do it. As far as a speed, like, do you have a certain speed for bending? Like, you have a certain rule for having something bend to stay rhythmically in time? If that makes sense.
It. I mean, you can. I mean, like with slide notes, it's super easy to just be like, this slide is half a beat, yay.
Right, that length, yeah.
But like, as far as automating stuff to do that, like I mean, having experimented with this, like it's very, it is very case by case. Like it's certain sounds sound better doing moving at certain speeds, certain ways. Certain songs, certain styles sound better having certain sounds moving in certain ways. Like it's all. I haven't really worked out a rule for it. It's just sort
Right.
of
You hadn't had to because of the way it does it, and that's almost.
yeah. Like even if I was doing it sort of the manual way, like with the trap stuff, like that stuff is just all over the place. It's just not. I mean, it's also kind of like guitar bending. Like when you play a guitar and you bend the strings, it bends in a certain way, and like
Mhm.
it doesn't feel like it when you're doing it because you're applying yourself a linear amount of force. But
Mhm.
as you're bending the string forces back more and more until eventually you can't pull it anymore. So that
Mhm.
means that like the actual kind of the way that guitar bends look, even though you're like making an automation that looks like with your hand that looks like this, what's actually happening is something like this.
Right.
And like this sort of stuff, like you need to kind of keep that in mind if you try to approximate something like that, because sometimes people like the sound of like a guitar pitch bend, but then when they try to do it themselves, it sounds like some kind of wacky vibrato, and
Right.
not like the more human and organic method of moving. And for stuff like the trap stuff, I feel like this is super relevant because the trap stuff, while it is all over the place, it is still it's very in where it is. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
So instead of doing something like I'm gonna go up here to straight like this, it's more like it does this, or like it might do that kind of thing. It isn't
Right.
just straight on the way.
Quicker, yeah.
So like that's the sort of stuff you need to experiment with in terms of rhythm, especially if we are talking about rhythm. Like this kind of stuff, like when it is just very straight, like the movement is very clearly centered on the beat. But then when you have something like this, the movement is less. It feels like it's less on time all of a sudden. Or even if we were to do something straight like this moves where the impact feels like it is from being over here to being like here.
Right.
And like that, because if you have certain kind of automation, you're doing certain things, and it feels like it's out of time. That's probably why.
Mhm. Okay.
You can just fix that, but by just moving it, to be in the right spot.
Yeah. Okay. Um, and what are some what tell me your top five things that just like you realized that helped you a lot.
Top five. Okay, well, let's see. The higher frequency thing about it not being as loud as lower frequencies to be as powerful was pretty important.
Okay.
Um, the idea that leveling, like turning stuff down in general, especially when you have your mastering on, like when you're compressing stuff and you're trying to
Hmm.
mix stuff under compression, leveling behaves in a very different way than you were expected to. So, like moving around with that can often solve a lot of mixing problems that you would try usually to solve really hard with like EQing and stuff like that.
Hmm.
So like leveling is a powerful thing. Um, uh, what else is important? Multi-band compression is great.
Would you use that from where would you use that in a chain on a certain sound?
Well, if I just use compression, I'm probably using multi-band compression.
Right. And
Just in
where would you use that
general.
in
Well, its primary use for me, like as far as its true value, is used in a mastering sense. Um, And then how that works out, like that's always the last thing in the chain because it needs to be the thing that limits everything at the end. But
Right.
as far as sound design goes, like there's not really any rules as to where things go for when. It's all
Sure.
very, very case by case. Like I said, like I might do something that has a lot of filters, and then I need to put EQing or compression after the filters, or I might do something that kind of has like that weird tail effect, like that Milo&Otis sound, and so I'll put the compression at the end of everything. Or there's this fun thing that happens when you do a Reese with just two oscillators that are sine waves, where just put them up there, and then they're kind of like they do that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And if you put a limiter right after that, you can make it do it really hard because you can see this is sort of what it's doing, and you can kind of push it. And then if you push that into the distortion, it becomes this sort of like this almost rhythmic percussive sound. And if you ever listen to any kind of like Cohen soundtrack that has like this sort of really harsh high frequency Reese thing, this is probably why.
So it's more of like a sine wavy type.
Well, the sine wave is just an example, but basically, because if you do put any kind of oscillator next to another copy of it with a different pitch, it's gonna do that. But like we said about the whole lower frequencies being more powerful than the higher frequencies, this effect will be much more obvious when it is a lower frequency and not just higher frequencies.
So you're getting that just by forcing it into the limiter, and it's creating a square wave basically to get the distortion.
Well, I have the limiter here, and then I have the distortion here. That's what the wave shaper is, distortion. And it like I put in what was the saw wave, and then I converted it to sine harmonics, and then I took out the lowest harmonic because the two sine waves are that harmonic, and then I can do something like. But if I didn't push it as hard into the limiter, it's not bad, but it's a different effect. And so if I push it, it just has that just sort of a very useful sort of effect that I like. And like that's how.
Now, being that you're pushing those sub frequencies into there, would you use that to represent your sub, or would you layer with the sound like that?
I would.
Would you layer a sub with that?
I would layer. I'm gonna layer a sub with anything I do.
Oh, okay.
See, this is the sound before it goes into the limiter. It's got the sine wave, and then it's got that, and then together, and then after the distortion, that's happening to it. And the reason why that's happening is because when there's no conflict, this sort of rising and lowering this is when the sine wave is at its loudest, and this is when the sine wave is essentially canceled out. And then the remaining level is just the remaining harmonics, which are not, in comparison, very loud. So if we push it, this is what's happening now is that when the sine wave gets louder, it's being pushed down to keep it below the threshold. But as it's pushing down, because it's all the same, it's all one signal, it pushes it down, and then it's pushing down the saw wave stuff as well.
So what two notes are you using there in that example?
2 and then 2.08. It's just a ratio, and then I think that's like maybe 30 cents.
Okay.
Not very much. I mean, the idea is that it's one oscillator and then another identical oscillator with a different pitch. It could be higher, it could be lower.
Right.
The faster the oscillation is, the higher the pitch it is.
Another question, now that we're getting to the end here. So modulating that, so you kind of got a tone from that from that sound by doing that. So you got a pretty I would say for you that's a pretty basic starting point. And then when you're looking at from there, you're doing some pitch bends and what kind of filtering would you do on that? And
Well,
you just kind of adding a bunch of stuff, just kind of seeing where it goes, or
usually, like sort of the stack like that I like to apply on this kind of stuff is to like I'll do like a bandpass filter, which is a lot of fun, which is muted. And then in here with the bandpass, I'd also do 2 notches, which are called band stops in the EQ. But like this, what I'm doing right now, being a bandpass and 2 notches, is something you can do with any bandpass and any 2 notches. And it also doesn't matter what order they're in, because the output, the result will be the same. So it's like, what the hell note is that? That's the right note. Yeah, that's right. So like, what notes I like? In beginnings of phrases, I like to start up high and then kind of bend down to whatever the root is. Let's say that root's F sharp because it's pretty common. And then, depending again on what kind of song I'm doing, I might stick to minor, stick to sort of tonic stuff, especially when I'm experimenting. Like right now, I would write random stuff like this, but I wouldn't really be trying to do anything. I'm just kind of putting stuff down that could be used, just so that while I'm working on the sound, I have an idea of what it sounds like. And I'll put down like a bunch of stuff, and then start automating filters. So we got bandpass, notches. The notches
basically throwing some paint on the canvas and seeing what sticks.
Pretty much. So right here is an example of what I meant by sort of dynamic range being introduced to the sound as a result of all the filtering, because now we can barely hear anything that's happening. This is when multi-band compression is awesome, because we can come in here, we can look at sort of what's going on, and we can individually on each band's basis bring back lost frequencies. We don't want to do it too hard, because again, the idea of filtering is that you are taking away frequencies. If you bring back all the frequencies, then you sort of remove the filter.
So you're kind of re-EQing with the multiband.
Kind of. And then once I've done that, I might put some distortion again. And then I'll do it again.
And what kind of distortion is that?
That's the wave shaper, and what I'm doing when I'm just sort of bending it. This is basic saturation, and sort of any distortion unit can do that. So
and what's a wave shaping distortion do exactly?
Wave shaping distortion is actually it's what all digital distortions do at their core. Every sort of digital distortion unit will have something like this in the background, sort of doing this to determine its transfer curve, which is what this does. And sort of what happens is that there's an input level and then there's an output level. If a sound comes in and it's like it's only so loud at one particular area, it's going to get pulled up to be whatever this line tells it to be, which could be something a little more complicated than what I'm doing. It could be some weirdness like that. Now the thing about it though is that I might not be immediately clear is that this is happening at the oscillation speed. So when the waveform comes up, it's being pulled up to shape to this line. And it's as a result, it's distorting the waveform, and it's adding harmonics, and it's becoming this audibly different sound that as a result. So yeah, this is sort of, that's the basic idea of what this does. And then so doing something like this is saying that this is a symmetrical wave shaper, which is to say this is happening to the positive and negative polarity of the waveform, but you can make it asymmetrical, where it's actually imparting different different curves to either the positive or the negative polarity of the waveform's oscillation, which can have interesting results, or it can be awful, one way or the other. Yeah, but then once I do that, I'll do another layer of the effect chain, which is to have the bandpass and the 2 notches, which is I could do more than 1 notch. I could just not have a notch. I could do 2 bandpasses, kind of thing. At this point, though, what we've done with the previous effect chain is to kind of create the character of the sound, and not so much to be what the sound will eventually be.
Right.
So then what we're doing now is the new, kind of like the new normal, and then again we'll need to sort of bring it back up with compression. And I mean, how many times you do that is kind of up to you, but this is a super basic example, sort of like the neuro kind of thing that I like to do.
Yeah, yeah. Any idea when the image line stuff's going to be available for OS X?
They're working on it.
Yeah.
I don't know how fast or how long or whatever. It's not something I really pay attention to, but it's definitely a priority for them.
Yeah, because I see these tools are just so specific, and so it's like, I don't know, they're very powerful tools.
Certainly, but like you could do this with Ableton stuff. Like everything that I've done is having been done with really basic stuff. Like the filters. I mean, any filter can do what I've done. The distortion, any distortion unit can do what I've done. The compression might be a bit harder to kind of approximate, but you do have multi-band distortion units in Ableton, and they can do they can approximately do this. They can do this to the point where it does the job.
Right.
And you can do the same stack, which is distortion, filtering, compression, distortion, filtering, compression, and the automation. You can do that. I mean, the stuff I did in Citrus also is a bit esoteric with like the weird oscillator window that I'm doing here and that kind of stuff. But Operator can do most of the things that Citrus does. Just not the. There are some very specific things in here that are kind of cool, but you can almost all of this is stuff that you can do. There are analogs too that in Ableton.
Very cool. Alrighty. Well, sounds like I got a lot to work on.
Good.
And congratulations with all your, it sounds like your hard work's really starting to bear some fruit. So, congratulations with that.
Thank you.
So I'll probably need to do some homework, work on it, and I think I need to probably be a little bit more better prepared next time I get with you on this. So, and maybe I'll have an example of some things for next time. But and I noticed, in your info sheet it said $75, and you had asked me to pay $45.
Yeah, that's because the price change happened after you had made contact initially.
Okay. Well, it's nice of you to go down and not up again. But it sounds like that price point's good for you as far as staying booked. So very good. Well, thanks, Stephen, and I'll do some work and hopefully contact you and get together with you again sometime.
Indeed. I'll put this up. I'm going to put this recording up onto YouTube as an unlisted video, and then I'll send you a link.
Okay, perfect.
Watch it whenever.
Perfect. Thanks so much.
No problem.
Have a good day.
You too.